Wow, this is just wow. I was not expecting this, and don't get me wrong, I was expecting, of course, a great racing game, and this is what we have here. I'm talking about HDR. I'm talking about the HDR implementation in this game because the PlayStation 5 version, the Xbox version, and also the PC version in terms of HDR. This is just fantastic. I really love it. And by the way, if you think this is right now good looking, this is just SDR actually. All the cutscenes are just in SDR colors and SDR brightness, but this already looks pretty good. Let's watch the rest. Okay, first of all, hello and welcome back to my channel. But first of all, I like to thank Ubisoft because thank you very much for the great support. I received actually 3 review codes for this game, PlayStation 5, Xbox and PC. So thank you very much for this great support. But by the way, if you like to test this game, there is still a trial going on as far as I'm aware of. Depending of course when you watch this video. But I can't stress it enough. This game is not just fun in terms of gameplay, in terms of HDR. Absolutely. So if you're an HDR lover and if you like to show off your latest display or your brand new TV, this game is must play. Okay, so let's talk about the very important things first. The Crew Motorfest does not support the HDR system level calibration, not on the Xbox Series X, not on the PlayStation 5 and not on the PC. And to be honest, of course it would be great if this game would support the HDR system level calibration on the platform, but to be very honest, it's actually not really necessary when we're having a look on this great HDR settings. But let's talk about this a little bit later. I would like to start here because this is something what we not have very often in games. So what you can see here right now, the dynamic range is actually HDR on and off, and this counts for PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. There's a difference on the PC version because we have actually 3 options. We have sRGB and we have sCRGB. And for this video we're focusing on HDR10 because what you can see, as soon you change this to sRGB or sCRGB, you actually fall back into the SDR range. And to be very honest, HDR10 is so good in this game, there's no point to use SDR. In regards of the HDR settings, we have actually 3 different settings, and I would like to start on the very end because the very top is actually very interesting. So let's start with this here, HDR brightness slider, which is the average picture brightness in this game. And this slider is, as the other sliders, very important actually to set up HDR in the correct way. And then we have the HDR white point slider, and what I found is that on my LG G2 and DCX with HGiG enabled, this is pretty accurate but not perfect. Let's say like this, but pretty much on the spot. And last but not least, we have HDR black level point. And this is most likely the most important setting in the game. And what you can see here right now is the standard factory setting when you start the game for the very first time. At least it was on the PlayStation 5, Xbox and PC in my case. The case. And what I don't understand is because this right now is terrible wrong, because with this setting you would have a lot of HDR black level rays. But now let's start talking about HDR, and I would say we start with the HDR black level rays, which right now, as you can see on my histogram, on the brightness histogram, is pretty much actually way too much, almost 1 nit HDR black level rays. And this is what you get when you start the game for the very first time, because this is right now the setting. HDR black level point, or the HDR black point, is set to the maximum. And what I found is, and I just show you this quickly, when you increase this to the absolute minimum, you get actually this, a much better picture. So in terms of the HDR black level point, it's very hard to make actually a proper recommendation for your screen, but as you can see here right now, we are not reaching actually complete black or complete dark. So there are some spots where the whole game has still lifted blacks, which is actually not too bad as I can tell on my screen, because it really does look okay. So, but what I would recommend is just start actually with the absolute minimum and increase this slightly if you have the feeling you crushing some blacks, then increase this slightly until you're happy. But my first recommendation is, in terms of the HDR black point, reduce this to the absolute minimum to get a much better picture in terms of contrast. And now let's talk about the next setting, the HDR white point setting, which is the maximum peak brightness for specular highlights in this game. And if you're using a TV with a dynamic tone mapping option and you don't have HGiG, or you like to use dynamic tone mapping on the LG TVs, then I would recommend just to follow the instruction on the screen and increase this until you barely can't see the pattern. But my recommendation would be enable HGiG if possible and follow the instruction until you hardly or barely can't see this logo anymore, which is right now. And then my recommendation is actually to increase this slider by 2 steps, 1, 2. And why? Here's why. When you follow the on-screen instruction with HGiG enabled, then I found that the maximum peak brightness is a little bit too low for my LG G2, because we know this TV has roughly a maximum peak brightness of around 1000 nits, let's say 950, okay, to be a little bit more precise. But what you can see here right now, it is actually just outputting 800 nits, which is a little bit too less in my opinion. So what I would recommend is just increase this by 1-2 steps after you follow the instruction, of course. And now we have almost 1000 nits, or let's say like this, 936 nits is fitting the LG G2 much better. And now let's talk about the last setting what we have in this game, the HDR brightness setting, which is changing or operating the HDR average picture brightness. And to demonstrate something, I activated the heat map in the HDR analyzer. And what you can see here right now is a very dark picture with some color in it, like these arrows here where you can see green arrows or yellowish green arrows. And everything on the picture right now, what has color in it, is exceeding the SDR brightness range. And as you can see at the moment, there's not much going on in terms of HDR brightness. So this right now, the arrows are just showing the color green. If you would see something like purple or red, then you would know that this is almost hitting 1000 nits or the maximum peak brightness what we have set in the game. But right now most of the game here is actually in the SDR brightness. And what I found is, and now we're talking about the HDR brightness setting here, so I'm not quite sure anymore what was the standard factory setting, but it was fairly low. So this right now of course is the minimum setting, which I would not recommend. So my recommendation is actually to increase this at least by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps. And you can see already on this test screen or test pattern that we now actually having a much brighter picture in terms of specular highlights. And this is exactly what we like to have. And now you can see actually also on the arrows that we have now suddenly a yellow color instead of green, and also the reflections actually showing now much brighter details. So this is of course exactly what we like to have when we're using HDR. But, and that's a good thing, you can increase the HDR brightness setting as you like it, because in terms of the maximum peak brightness, there is not much of a difference. The only thing what you need to consider is that you now actually displaying a lot of specular highlights with the maximum peak brightness, which may or may not leads to some blown out details. And now let's talk about color space. And I know this picture right now looks absolutely weird, but I have activated the color space map on the HDR analyzer. And what you can see here right now is yellow and blue and some black details actually. So everything what you can see here in blue is DCI P3 color space. Everything else what you can see in yellow is actually BT 2020. So right now, when we look at the numbers, 82% of the picture or the screen or the picture information is actually using the BT 2020 color space. And this is something, of course, what we like to have in our HDR implementation. So this game, in my opinion, is just perfect for QD OLED. And now let's talk about HGiG, dynamic tone mapping on and dynamic tone mapping off. And as in many other games, I would not recommend to use dynamic tone mapping off, because you will lose a lot of fine details or absolute maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. When it comes to HGiG or dynamic tone mapping on, for this game I recommend HGiG because, yeah, first of all, dynamic tone mapping on is overbrighten a picture a little bit too much and you will experience slightly more clipping and specular highlights. And yeah, the great thing in this game is actually that we have a HDR brightness setting which is working pretty well. That means if you think HGiG is a little bit too dark, just increase the HDR brightness. And of course you can use Dolby Vision for gaming on the Xbox Series X and S, but don't expect a very big difference, because there shouldn't be any difference, because there is no native Dolby Vision support in this game. That means HDR10 with activated HGiG on OLED TVs like the LG should look very similar to Dolby Vision gaming. The only reason if there is any difference is most likely because of different picture settings between the HDR10 HGiG picture mode and the Dolby Vision gaming mode. Okay, my friends, so that's it for this video. And yeah, I don't know what you think, but again, in terms of HDR, in terms of gameplay, I like games like that. You know, you're just cruising around a little bit and it's just fun and it really does look good. So what I'm going to do is also I'm working on a performance video about this game for a PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and of course PC. So make sure, if you like this video, you make sure that you like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.